Chapter 1. The highway stretched endlessly into the dark, a thin ribbon of cracked asphalt that cut through the barren landscape. Elliot squinted at the faded lines on the road, his eyes burning with fatigue. The truck's headlights flickered momentarily, casting jagged shadows across the roadside scrub before stabilizing again. He cursed under his breath, giving the dashboard a sharp slap, though he knew it wouldn't help. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty, the needle jittering with every bump. His GPS had gone silent 30 miles back, the screen frozen mid-recalculation. The faint hum of static on the radio filled the cab, a monotonous companion to the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt. The darkness outside was absolute, an oppressive void that seemed to press against the windshield. Elliot gripped the wheel tighter, forcing himself to stay awake. He'd been pushing it too hard, too many hours on the road, too little sleep. But that was life now. He hadn't taken a proper break in weeks, and stopping meant letting the weight of everything catch up with him. He wasn't ready for that. Then, out of nowhere, the fog rolled in. It wasn't a gradual drift, but an abrupt, suffocating blanket. One moment, the horizon was a faint line of darkness against the night sky. The next, everything beyond the hood of the truck vanished into swirling grey. Elliot slowed to a crawl, his hands clammy on the steering wheel. "Shit!" he muttered, leaning forward as if that would help him see farther. The truck's headlights were nearly useless now, the beams dissolving into the dense mist. The road seemed to narrow, or maybe it was his imagination. He glanced at the GPS again, but the frozen map still showed him in the middle of nowhere. The static on the radio crackled louder, a faint, garbled voice slipping through for just a moment before vanishing. He turned the knob, searching for anything. Music, a weather report, something to ground him, but the airwaves were empty. His heart jolted when the neon sign emerged from the fog. Forgotten Mile Motel, vacancy, it read, the words flickering unevenly. A single arrow pointed down a narrow, unmarked road. Elliot slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a stop. He stared at the sign, the letters buzzing faintly in the silence. It hadn't been there a second ago. He was sure of it. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. The idea of pulling into some backwater motel in the middle of the night filled him with unease. But then his fuel gauge caught his eye, the needle dipping lower. He couldn't risk breaking down out here. Not in this fog. Not when he couldn't even see the road ahead. Grumbling to himself, he turned the wheel and followed the arrow. The road leading to the motel was little more than a gravel path, flanked by withered trees that loomed like skeletons in the mist. The truck's tires crunched loudly against the loose stones, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Ahead, the motel came into view, its shape materializing from the fog like a phantom. It was a squat, single-story building with peeling paint and a sagging roof. A dim light flickered in the lobby window, casting weak shadows across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. A handful of cars were parked outside, their hoods coated in dust, windows smeared with grime. None of them looked like they'd been driven in years. Elliot pulled into an empty space near the entrance and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He sat there for a moment, staring at the building. Something about it felt wrong, too still, too quiet. But exhaustion weighed heavily on him, and the thought of driving back into the fog with an empty tank wasn't an option. With a sigh, he grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat and climbed out of the truck. The air was damp and cold, clinging to his skin like a wet sheet. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the front door. A bell jingled weakly when he pushed it open, the sound barely audible over the low hum of fluorescent lights. The lobby was small and sparsely furnished, with a faded couch pushed against one wall and a coffee table littered with outdated magazines. The walls were a sickly yellow, the kind of colour that suggested decades of cigarette smoke and neglect. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he hadn't slept in years. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, and his mouth stretched into a too-wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Evening," the man said, his voice hoarse and flat. "Need a room?" Elliot hesitated, glancing around the empty lobby. "Yeah, just for the night." The man nodded slowly and reached under the counter, pulling out a tarnished key attached to a wooden fob. The number 6 was carved into it, the edges worn smooth. "Room 6, the man said, sliding the key across the counter. "Checkout's at sunrise." Elliot frowned. "Sunrise? What kind of motel has a checkout that early?" The clerk's smile widened slightly. "Those are the rules." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down Elliot's spine. He stared at the man for a moment longer before taking the key. "Right. Thanks," he muttered, turning toward the hallway. "Enjoy your stay," the clerk called after him. The words hung in the air, faintly mocking. Elliot didn't look back. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Room 6. The hallway stretched out in front of him, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs. The carpet beneath his boots was threadbare and stained, and the walls were covered in peeling beige wallpaper. Room numbers hung crookedly on each door, their brass plating dulled by years of neglect. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, mixed with something else, something sharp and metallic. Elliot found room 6 near the end of the hallway. The door looked like the others, scratched, scuffed, and warped from years of wear. The brass number 6 hung slightly askew, and the key turned in the lock with an unnervingly loud click. He pushed the door open, half expecting the hinges to squeal, but they didn't. The door swung inward smoothly, silently. The room was as drab and uninviting as the rest of the motel. A single bed with a faded floral print comforter dominated the space. Beside it stood a small, thick wooden nightstand with a rotary phone and a lamp whose shade was stained with an ominous brown discoloration. The walls were painted an off-white that had yellowed with time, and the ceiling fan turned lazily, its blades wobbling with each rotation. Elliot set his duffel bag on the bed and shut the door behind him, sliding the chain lock into place and giving it a tug to make sure it held. He glanced around, taking stock. The window on the far wall was small, covered by heavy curtains that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. He peeked behind them briefly, but saw only the dense fog outside, illuminated faintly by the glow of the parking lot light. His truck was still there, a reassuring silhouette in the gloom. He flicked on the lamp, its weak glow barely illuminating the room. The rotary phone on the nightstand looked ancient, the kind of thing you'd see in a thrift store. Out of curiosity, he picked up the receiver and pressed it to his ear. Silence. No dial tone. He set it back down. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of cracked tiles and a grimy sink. Elliot walked over and nudged it open with the toe of his boot. The bathroom was just as neglected as the rest of the room. A large, discoloured mirror hung above the sink, its surface cloudy with age. The toilet looked functional, though he wasn't eager to test it, and the shower curtain was drawn tightly closed, its edges frayed and stained. Elliot hesitated for a moment, then reached out and pulled the curtain back. The tub was empty, though rust stains streaked the porcelain like dried blood. He let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the main room. Despite the thick walls, the faint hum of the motel's lights seemed to vibrate in his ears. He sat on the edge of the bed and reached down to untie his boots, his movements slow and deliberate. The mattress sagged under his weight, the springs groaning in protest. As he leaned back against the headboard, he caught sight of something on the ceiling. Faint, dark streaks running from one corner toward the center of the room. Water damage, probably. Still, the pattern made him uneasy. It almost looked like something had been dragged across the ceiling. Elliot rubbed his eyes, shaking his head. "You're just tired," he muttered to himself. "Get some sleep and get out of here in the morning." The first sound came just as he was starting to drift off. It was faint, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on carpet. His eyes snapped open, and he sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the hallway. Elliot swung his legs over the side of the bed and grabbed his boots, pulling them on quickly. The noise continued, slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped just outside his door. He stared at the handle, his breath caught in his throat. A soft knock broke the silence, so light he almost thought he'd imagined it. He didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. After a moment, the knock came again, harder this time. Then, silence. Elliot waited, his heart hammering in his chest. Minutes passed, but the doorknob never moved. Slowly, he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He stood, moving cautiously toward the door, and pressed his ear against it. Nothing. He unlatched the chain lock and opened the door a crack, peering into the hallway. It was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, their pale glow casting long shadows. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air, unchanged. Elliot stepped back inside, locking the door firmly behind him. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but the emptiness was almost worse than finding someone there. The second sound came about an hour later. This time, it was a scraping noise, like nails being dragged across the door. Elliot shot upright, his pulse racing. The sound was slow and deliberate, moving from the top of the door to the bottom. He grabbed the rotary phone from the nightstand and lifted it again, hoping for a dial tone. Nothing. He slammed it back down, his breathing ragged. The scraping stopped and the room fell silent again. Elliot waited, frozen in place, listening intently for any hint of movement. The silence stretched on, oppressive and heavy. Then he heard it, the faintest creak of floorboards, coming from inside the room. His eyes darted toward the bathroom door. It was open just a fraction wider than before. "Hello?" he called out, his voice hoarse. No answer. He grabbed his duffel bag, rummaging through it for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a tire iron, and he pulled it out, gripping it tightly. Slowly he moved toward the bathroom, his footsteps silent on the carpet. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The bathroom was empty, just as it had been before. The mirror above the sink reflected his pale, sweat-slicked face. He turned, scanning the rest of the room, but found nothing out of place. Elliot let out a shaky breath and stepped back into the main room. He placed the tire iron on the nightstand and sat back on the bed, his back against the wall. He wouldn't be sleeping tonight. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Hallways. The hours stretched on, heavy and endless. Elliot sat on the edge of the bed, the tire iron resting on his lap. His hands gripped it tightly, the cold metal grounding him in the suffocating silence of the room. His ears strained for every sound, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional groan of the building's old pipes, the shifting of the ceiling fan's wobbling blades. But the worst part was the hallway. Every so often, he thought he could hear it again, the soft, deliberate shuffle of footsteps outside his door. They would start faint, grow louder, and then stop just as quickly. Each time he'd freeze, staring at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. It never did. At some point, he couldn't take it anymore. Elliot rose from the bed, his knees stiff and his heart pounding. He slid the chain lock off the door as quietly as he could and eased it open just a crack. The hallway stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by the same buzzing lights. The air felt cooler here, heavier somehow. He stepped outside, his boots sinking slightly into the threadbare carpet. The hallway was empty. It was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the lights above. Elliot turned to look back at room 6, its door still ajar behind him. He hesitated for a moment, then left it open. He wanted to keep it in sight. As he moved down the hall, he noticed how uneven the numbers on the doors were. They didn't seem to follow any logical order. Room 4 was directly across from room 8, and a few steps down, room 11 sat sandwiched between rooms 2 and 3. The brass plates were scratched and dented, as though someone had tried to pry them off. The carpet grew more stained the farther he walked, dark blotches spreading out like ink spills. At one point, he stepped over a piece of broken glass, its edges gleaming faintly in the light. A quick glance at the nearby door revealed deep gouges in the wood, as though someone or something had tried to claw their way in. Elliot's grip tightened on the tire iron. The sound came again, soft footsteps, just around the corner at the end of the hall. His breath caught in his throat and he froze, staring at the bend ahead. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural stillness in their wake. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly in the empty hallway. No response. Elliot took a cautious step forward, his boots making the faintest creak against the carpet. He rounded the corner slowly, the tire iron raised. The hallway stretched on, empty as before. But something was different. The air felt colder here, and the faint metallic smell that lingered throughout the motel was stronger. He squinted at the end of the hall, where a door stood slightly ajar. A faint, flickering light came from within, casting erratic shadows across the floor. The brass plate on the door read, "Room 7." Elliot approached cautiously, his pulse hammering in his ears. He nudged the door open with the tire iron, the hinges groaning softly. Inside, the flickering light came from a small, outdated television sitting on a wooden dresser. Its screen showed only static, the grey and white fuzz casting harsh, shifting light across the room. The rest of the room was eerily identical to his own. The same floral print comforter, the same rotary phone, the same faded curtains. But this room wasn't empty. A suitcase sat open on the bed, its contents spilled out haphazardly. Clothes, personal items, and a crumpled map were scattered across the comforter. Elliot took a cautious step inside, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. The air felt wrong in here, heavier, colder. He moved closer to the bed, his gaze falling on the map. It was old and torn, the ink faded, but he could make out a route drawn in red pen. It ended abruptly at a small X near an unmarked road. Scribbled next to it were the words, "Forgotten Mile." Elliot's chest tightened. The map wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever had been staying here had come to this motel deliberately. But why? And where were they now? A faint creak behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. He spun around, the tire iron raised, but the room was empty. The door was still ajar, swaying slightly as though disturbed by a draught. His breathing quickened, and he backed away, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. The static from the television grew louder, more grating, until it felt like it was filling his head. He reached out and yanked the cord from the wall, plunging the room into silence. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Then, from somewhere deeper in the motel, a door slammed shut. Elliot bolted out of room 7, his boots thudding against the carpet as he made his way back toward room 6. The hallway seemed longer now, the lights dimmer. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. He didn't know what was happening, but he needed to get out. He needed to leave. When he reached room 6, he froze. The door was shut. He was certain he'd left it open, but now it was closed tight, the chain lock dangling uselessly against the wood. He reached for the knob, his fingers trembling. It turned easily under his hand, and the door swung open with a soft creak. The room was exactly as he'd left it, except for one thing. The rotary phone on the nightstand was off the hook, the receiver resting against the carpet. A faint, rhythmic static emanated from the speaker, rising and falling like shallow breaths. Elliot stared at it, his blood running cold. Slowly, he stepped inside and picked up the receiver. "Hello," he whispered, his voice barely audible. For a moment there was only static. Then, faintly, a voice crackled through. "You shouldn't have left." End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Other Guest. Elliot stared at the phone in his hand, his grip tightening as the faint, rhythmic static filled his ears. The words he'd heard, or thought he'd heard, played over and over in his mind. "You shouldn't have left." He slammed the receiver back onto the cradle, the sound sharp and final in the suffocating quiet. For a long moment he stood there, breathing heavily, trying to convince himself that it was just exhaustion, that he was imagining things. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. The motel wasn't right. He had felt it the moment he arrived. Gripping the tire iron tightly, Elliot decided to leave the room again. Staying inside felt just as dangerous as stepping out. He needed to get out of this place altogether, find someone, anyone, who could tell him what the hell was going on. The lobby was dimly lit, the same faint yellow glow emanating from the overhead lights. It smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, a smell he couldn't shake no matter where he went in this place. The front desk sat empty, its scratched surface illuminated by the faint hum of a flickering neon vacancy sign visible through the window. Elliot's boots echoed softly on the cracked tile floor as he scanned the room. His eyes landed on a figure slouched in one of the threadbare chairs against the wall. It was a man, thin, wiry, and utterly dishevelled. His clothes were rumpled and stained, his hair a greasy mess. His eyes were bloodshot and hollow, darting nervously around the room as if he were expecting something or someone. His hands fidgeted endlessly with a piece of fabric that looked like an old handkerchief, twisting and wringing it over and over. Elliot hesitated, then took a cautious step closer. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse. "You okay?" The man didn't respond at first. His hands kept working the fabric, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Then abruptly, he spoke, his voice low and rasping. "You shouldn't stay here," the man muttered, barely loud enough for Elliot to hear. Elliot frowned. "What are you talking about? Do you work here? What's going on in this place?" The man shook his head violently, his movements jittery and unnatural. "No one works here. Not really. Not for long." He glanced at Elliot, his eyes wide with fear. "You got to leave, before sunrise." "Sunrise?" Elliot stepped closer, his pulse quickening. "What happens at sunrise?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a soft, breathy laugh that sent a chill down Elliot's spine. "The ones who came before," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "They don't like it when you stay." Elliot opened his mouth to demand more answers, but the man suddenly shot to his feet, clutching the handkerchief like a lifeline. "I told you what I could," he said, backing away toward the darkened hallway. "If you're smart, you'll leave." He turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Elliot standing alone in the lobby. The hallways felt longer than before, stretching endlessly in both directions. The faint hum of the lights above seemed louder now, pressing against his eardrums. As Elliot passed door after door, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Then he saw her. At the far end of the hallway, a woman stood with her back to him. Her shoulders shook as though she were crying, and her arms hung limply at her sides. She wore a pale blue dress that looked old-fashioned, its hem tattered and frayed. Elliot slowed, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But something compelled him to step closer. "Ma'am?" he called out softly, his voice echoing faintly. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. Her sobbing grew louder, more desperate. Elliot took another step forward, though gripping the tire iron tightly. "Do you need help?" he asked again. As he approached, the woman turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough that he could see the edge of her cheek. Her sobs stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural noise that didn't sound human. Elliot froze. The woman turned the corner at the end of the hallway and vanished from view. He stood there for a long moment, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. But he forced himself to move forward. He needed to know where she'd gone. Maybe she was another guest. Maybe she could explain what was happening. When he rounded the corner, the hallway was empty. Back in front of room 7, Elliot stopped in his tracks. The door was slightly ajar again, and this time the flickering light of the television spilled into the hallway. Static buzzed faintly from within, the sound grating against his nerves. He tightened his grip on the tire iron and approached cautiously. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was almost identical to before. The bed unmade, the open suitcase on the mattress, the television blaring its static. But this time, something was different. On the floor near the bed lay a shoe, a single, worn sneaker, the laces frayed. It hadn't been there before. Elliot's gaze flicked to the television. The static shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though it were trying to form an image. He squinted, stepping closer. A sharp knock echoed from behind him, and he spun around, the tire iron raised. The hallway was empty. When he turned back to the room, the television had gone dark. Elliot's heart raced as he backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. He didn't know what he'd just seen, if he'd seen anything at all. But the feeling that had been gnawing at him all night was stronger now, undeniable. He was being watched. Chapter 5. Missing. Elliot burst through the front doors of the motel, the cold, damp air outside hitting him like a slap to the face. The fog was as thick as ever, swirling around the parking lot in ghostly tendrils. His boots crunched against the gravel as he strode toward the space where his truck had been parked. But the truck was gone. He stopped dead in his tracks, his pulse quickening as he stared at the empty spot. There were no other vehicles nearby except the same dusty, abandoned cars that had been there when he'd arrived. His truck, his lifeline out of this hellhole, was nowhere in sight. His eyes darted across the lot, searching for some clue, some sign of where it had gone. That's when he noticed the tire marks. They led away from the space, disappearing into the dense fog that swallowed the edge of the parking lot. No, he muttered under his breath, his voice rising in panic. He followed the marks a few feet before they vanished into the mist. The fog seemed to thicken the farther he went, the air growing colder and heavier. He stopped, realizing he couldn't see more than a few steps ahead, and turned back toward the motel. The glowing neon sign buzzed faintly above the building, its light flickering unevenly. He felt a spike of anger and fear rise in his chest as he stormed back inside. The clerk was waiting at the front desk, standing unnaturally still. His pale face stretched into that same wide, unsettling smile, his sunken eyes following Elliot as he marched toward him. "Where's my truck?" Elliot demanded, his voice sharp and loud in the quiet lobby. "It's gone." The clerk's smile didn't falter. "I'm sorry, sir. You must be mistaken. You arrived on foot." Elliot froze, his breath catching. "What the hell are you talking about? I drove here. My truck was parked right outside. I saw it not even an hour ago." The clerk tilted his head slightly, as though Elliot were a child he was patiently humouring. "I don't recall seeing a truck, sir. Perhaps you're confused. These long nights on the road can play tricks on the mind." Elliot slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing through the empty lobby. "Don't give me that bullshit! Someone stole it! I want to know who else is staying here. Who else might have taken it?" The clerk's expression didn't change, but his voice shifted slightly, taking on a more pointed edge. "Sir, I must insist that you calm down." "Calm down? Are you kidding me?" Elliot's voice cracked with frustration, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm stranded out here because someone took my goddamn truck." The clerk's smile wavered for the first time. It didn't disappear entirely, but something about it changed. It became tighter, more forced. His tone dropped, colder now. "I assure you, there's no need to get upset. These things have a way of sorting themselves out. In the morning, I'm sure everything will be fine." Elliot felt the floor drop out from under him. "In the morning? You think I'm going to sit around and wait? I need my truck now. I need to leave this place." The clerk's eyes flickered with something darker, an edge of irritation, or perhaps something else entirely. "Sir," he said slowly, his tone measured but laced with warning, "I would suggest you return to your room and get some rest. It's late. You'll feel better after a good night's sleep." Elliot stared at the man, every nerve in his body screaming at him to keep pushing, to demand answers. But something about the way the clerk spoke, the calm yet unwavering finality of it, made him hesitate. He felt the weight of the man's gaze pressing down on him, cold and unblinking. Defeated, he turned and walked back toward the hallway. Behind him, the clerk's voice drifted after him, eerily smooth. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Carter." When Elliot stepped back into room 6, he immediately knew something was wrong. The air was heavier than before, thick and oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang that made his stomach churn. The first thing he noticed was the stain on the carpet. It had grown, spreading outward like an ink blot. The edges were darker now, almost black, and the faint smell of rot seemed to rise from it. His eyes flicked to the mirror above the dresser. For a moment his reflection seemed normal, just his pale face and wide eyes staring back at him. But as he stepped closer, he froze. Behind him, barely visible in the dim light, was the faint outline of a figure. It stood just over his shoulder, blurry and indistinct, like a smudge on the glass. Elliot spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but the room was empty. He turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. His own reflection stared back at him, gaunt and sweating. His breathing quickened as he moved to the bed, his eyes darting around the room. The lampshade flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights outside seeped through the thin door, growing louder in his ears. Elliot sat down on the edge of the bed, gripping the tire iron so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air felt colder now, pressing in on him from all sides. He stared at the stain on the carpet, at the flickering lamp, at the heavy curtains drawn tight over the window. He didn't feel alone anymore. And somewhere deep in the motel, he thought he could hear footsteps. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Basement. The air in the room shifted abruptly, heavy and stifling. Elliot had been sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to steady his breathing and push back the panic gnawing at the edges of his mind. But the change in the air snapped him out of his thoughts. He wiped at his forehead and realized he was sweating profusely. The room felt oppressively hot, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and refused to let go. He shot a glance toward the air conditioning unit mounted on the wall. Its small light flickered, indicating it was still running, but the air it blew was warm, almost hot. He got up, crossing the room in 2 strides, and fiddled with the thermostat. The dial turned easily under his fingers, but the temperature didn't change. If anything, it seemed to get worse, the heat growing thicker, almost suffocating. "Come on, you piece of crap," he muttered, jabbing at the buttons in frustration. The air conditioning unit wheezed but offered no relief. Sweat dripped down his neck as the temperature climbed higher, and Elliot's patience snapped. He gripped the thermostat and yanked it off the wall in one violent motion. It came away with a crack, dangling wires spilling out like veins. But his breath caught when he saw what was behind it. The wires didn't lead anywhere. They were cut off, disconnected, and useless. The thermostat was just for show. Elliot stared at the exposed wall, his chest tightening. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He traced the wires with his fingers, trying to make sense of it. The heat, it wasn't coming from the unit at all. Someone else was controlling it. Someone outside the room. He backed away, the exposed wall suddenly feeling like an open wound in the otherwise claustrophobic space. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. The noise outside his door, the disappearing truck, the figures he'd seen, it all pointed to something more deliberate, something planned. Fueled by desperation, Elliot decided he needed answers. The hallways were eerily quiet as he stepped out of room 6, his boots thudding softly against the stained carpet. He gripped the tire iron tightly, his knuckles white as he moved with purpose through the motel's winding corridors. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, shifting shadows that made the space feel alive. He passed the front desk without stopping, the clerk nowhere to be seen. His eyes scanned the lobby, looking for anything out of place, anything that might explain what was happening. That's when he noticed a door tucked behind the counter, partially hidden by a faded employees-only sign. It was slightly ajar, revealing a set of stairs leading downward. Elliot hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But the oppressive heat in his room, the severed thermostat wires, and the unsettling encounters with the other guests drove him forward. He needed to know what was down there. The basement smelled of mildew and damp earth, the air thick and cold compared to the stifling heat upstairs. The walls were concrete, cracked in places, and the dim light from a single exposed bulb cast long shadows across the floor. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, creating a rhythm that set his nerves on edge. Elliot moved cautiously, his boots scuffing against the concrete floor as he entered a cluttered utility area. The space was filled with old machinery, boilers, water heaters, and rusted electrical panels. But what drew his attention was a set of shelves along the far wall. The shelves were cluttered with luggage, wallets, and personal belongings. Dust-covered suitcases, cracked leather bags, and old-fashioned trunks sat in disarray, their contents spilling out in some places. Elliot's stomach churned as he approached, his fingers trembling as he reached for the nearest wallet. He flipped it open and found an old ID card inside. The photo was faded, but the face was unmistakable, the dishevelled man he'd seen in the lobby. The name on the card read, Arthur Mallory. A wave of nausea rolled over him as he rifled through more of the items. Another wallet revealed the driver's license of a woman. Her face was young and pale, her eyes hollow even in the photo. He recognized her immediately. It was the woman in the hallway, the one who had vanished around the corner. Elliot's heart pounded as he stepped back, his foot knocking over a suitcase. He stumbled, catching himself against one of the shelves. Something metallic clattered to the floor, and when he looked down, he saw a tarnished wristwatch lying at his feet. He picked it up, the back engraved with the initials LK. It was a simple item, unremarkable except for the fact that it felt too personal, too intimate. These people weren't just guests. They'd been here, left their belongings behind. But where were they now? His breath came in shallow gasps as his eyes darted around the room, searching for any other clues. That's when he noticed something else. On the floor, near the corner of the room, was a pile of shoes. They were mismatched, scuffed, and clearly old, some of them covered in mould. It was too much. The room felt suffocating, the shadows pressing in around him. Elliot backed toward the stairs, his tire iron slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. He needed to leave. Elliot stormed back into room 6, his mind racing. He grabbed his duffel bag and threw it onto the bed, shoving his belongings inside with trembling hands. His heart hammered as he replayed everything he'd seen. The IDs, the belongings, the way the clerk had smiled so calmly while he lied about the truck. This wasn't a motel. It was a trap. A place people came to disappear. He zipped the bag and slung it over his shoulder, gripping the tire iron tightly. The plan was simple. He'd run. Into the fog, into the unknown. He didn't care where, as long as it was away from here. If the truck wasn't an option, he'd take his chances on foot. But as he reached for the door, the knob wouldn't turn. Elliot froze, his chest tightening. He twisted the knob harder, pulling and jerking at it with all his strength, but it didn't budge. It was as though the door had fused with the frame, unyielding and immovable. No, 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 he muttered, his voice rising. He slammed his shoulder against the door, the impact rattling the chain lock but accomplishing nothing. His panic grew as he pounded on the wood, his fists aching with the effort. The air in the room grew heavier, colder. The light flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. From behind him, faintly, he heard the sound of breathing. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Disturbance. The air in the room seemed to pulse, suffocating and alive. Elliot's hands trembled as he backed away from the unyielding door, his chest heaving with shallow, frantic breaths. The breathing sound persisted, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere behind him. His skin crawled as he turned around, his eyes darting frantically across the room. The telephone on the nightstand was off the hook again. It lay sideways on the stained carpet, the receiver tilted just enough for the static-filled line to hiss faintly. The sound wasn't just static, though. There was something else beneath it, a low, rhythmic wheeze. Breathing. Elliot's pulse pounded in his ears as he approached the phone, his legs feeling like lead. He stared at the receiver, sweat dripping down his temples, before finally reaching out with a shaking hand to pick it up. The static grew louder for a moment, crackling and uneven, before the voice of the clerk broke through. "Mr. Carter," the voice drawled, eerily calm, "I must insist that you remain in your room. Loitering in the halls and making a ruckus is disturbing the other guests." Elliot's throat tightened, his mind racing. The voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something hard and cold that sent a shiver down his spine. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The clerk continued, "Please be respectful, Mr. Carter. You wouldn't want to upset anyone." The line went dead. Elliot stared at the receiver, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Slowly he lowered it back onto the cradle, the silence of the room pressing in on him like a physical weight. The heat in the room surged, oppressive and relentless. His sweat-soaked shirt clung to his skin, and the metallic tang in the air grew stronger, almost unbearable. Elliot stumbled to the window, desperate for fresh air. He tugged at the heavy curtains, throwing them aside, and gripped the edges of the window frame. It was bolted shut. His fingers scrabbled at the edges of the frame, searching for a latch or lock, but there was nothing. The bolts holding the window in place were rusted and solid, mocking his attempts to force it open. He pressed his forehead against the glass, staring into the swirling fog outside, and let out a frustrated growl. The telephone blared behind him. The sudden sound made him jump, the shrill tone cutting through the oppressive silence. He turned, glaring at the phone as it rang over and over, an unrelenting screech that seemed to dig into his skull. His patience snapped. "Enough!" he shouted, snatching up the tire iron. With a single furious swing, he shattered the window. The crash reverberated through the room, the cool night air rushing in to meet him. Shards of glass clattered to the floor, some catching the light and sparkling like jagged stars. Elliot didn't care about the noise, didn't care if the clerk, or whatever he was, heard him. He grabbed his duffel bag, slung it over his shoulder, and climbed onto the ledge. The air outside was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the room. He placed one leg out, gripping the window frame tightly as he prepared to hoist himself out into the fog. Behind him, the door creaked. Elliot froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't turn around, didn't look back. The door creaked again, louder this time, followed by the faint sound of footsteps on the carpet. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to move. He swung his other leg over the ledge, but in his haste his arm caught a jagged shard of glass still clinging to the frame. A sharp, searing pain shot through him as the glass tore into his skin, leaving a deep gash that immediately began to bleed. Damn it, he hissed through gritted teeth, but he didn't stop. He scrambled out of the window, his boots slipping slightly on the concrete ledge outside. The sound of the door opening fully reached his ears, a slow, deliberate creak that set every nerve in his body alight with terror. The heavy thud of footsteps followed, moving steadily across the room. Elliot didn't look back. He launched himself off the ledge and into the fog, hitting the ground with a jarring thud. His duffel bag spilled open, its contents scattering around him, but he didn't stop to collect them. He pushed himself up, his arm throbbing and slick with blood, and stumbled into the mist. The cold air burned his lungs as he ran blindly, the motel fading into the grey void behind him. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just needed to get away. Chapter 8. Light approaches. The clerk pushed open the door to room 6 with a force that sent it banging against the wall. The dim light of the flickering lamp illuminated the scene inside. The shattered window, shards of glass scattered across the floor, and the faint metallic scent of fresh blood lingering in the air. His face twisted into a grimace as his eyes darted to the empty room, then to the gaping hole where the window once was. He strode to the window, his boots crunching on broken glass, and peered out into the fog. For a moment he saw nothing but the swirling grey mist. Then, faintly, a shadow, a figure moving in the distance. "There you are," he muttered, lifting the double-barrel shotgun he'd been carrying. The clerk aimed into the fog, his movements deliberate and steady, and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the still air, shattering the fragile silence. A burst of light and sound tore through the fog, but when it cleared, the shadow was gone. The clerk's lips curled into a snarl, and he cursed under his breath. He spun around and stormed out of the room, his boots pounding against the carpet. He descended the stairs into the parking lot with long, purposeful strides, his shotgun gripped tightly in his hands. The fog hung thick around him, but he moved with confidence, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of his prey. That's when he saw it, a dark smear of blood leading away from the shattered glass scattered beneath the window. A low chuckle rumbled from his throat as he knelt down, scooping up Elliot's wallet from the pile of belongings spilled nearby. He opened it with one hand, flipping through the worn contents, a few crumpled bills, a faded photo of a younger Elliot and his ID. "Elliot Carter," the clerk drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're making this a lot harder on yourself than it needs to be." He pocketed the wallet and rose to his feet, following the trail of blood into the fog. Each step was deliberate, the sound of his boots crunching against the gravel amplified in the suffocating quiet. The trail twisted and turned through the parking lot, winding toward the far side where the dense fog concealed whatever lay beyond. The clerk's voice echoed through the mist as he shouted into the void. "You can't run forever, Carter. This place don't let people leave. You think you're clever hiding out in the fog? I'll find you. I always find you." The trail of blood led him farther from the motel, past the cracked pavement of the parking lot and into the scraggly remains of a tree line. The fog thinned slightly here, the pale grey light of the approaching dawn casting faint shadows against the gnarled trunks. He quickened his pace, his grip tightening on the shotgun as he muttered curses under his breath. "Stupid bastard. You should have just stayed in your room like I told you. Could have made it easy on yourself." As he pushed through the trees, something began to emerge in the distance, a large, dark shape rising out of the mist. At first it was little more than a shadow, but as the sun continued its slow ascent, the details sharpened. A truck. Elliot's truck, hidden behind a clump of trees, its bulk partially obscured by the fog. The blood trail led directly to it. The clerk cursed again, his boots pounding against the soft earth as he broke into a jog. He could feel his heartbeat quicken, a mixture of frustration and anticipation bubbling inside him. "You're not getting out of here, Carter," he shouted, his voice carrying across the clearing. "This place don't let people leave. You think you can run? You think you can drive away? Not going to happen, boy." He was close now, close enough to make out the truck's rusted exterior and the faint glint of the side mirror in the dim light. His pace quickened, his breaths coming harder as he neared the driver's side door. He raised the shotgun, ready to fire, determined to end this game once and for all. But before he could reach the truck, the engine roared to life. The sudden sound startled him, and he skidded to a halt. The headlights flared on, twin beams of brilliant light cutting through the dissipating fog. They hit the clerk square in the face, blinding him. He stumbled backward, raising an arm to shield his eyes, but the light was unrelenting, burning through the mist and erasing everything else from his vision. "Damn it!" he growled, stumbling back farther as the engine revved, the truck roaring like some awakened beast. The clerk squinted against the light, his shotgun still raised but wavering slightly as he tried to aim blindly toward the source of the noise. "You think this'll stop me?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "You think you can get away?" But before he could do anything else, the truck's engine roared again, louder this time, and the vehicle began to move. Chapter 9. The Vacancy. The shotgun blast tore through the windshield, shattering glass and spraying jagged shards across the cab. Elliot ducked instinctively, his arms shielding his face as the truck swerved slightly. The roar of the gunshot still rang in his ears as he gritted his teeth, slammed his foot on the accelerator, and charged forward. The headlights cut through the dissipating fog, illuminating the clerk standing in the center of the road, his shotgun raised for another shot. But Elliot wasn't stopping. The truck roared forward, its tires screaming against the pavement, and the clerk's face twisted into something between rage and resignation. The impact was solid, a sickening thud that reverberated through the cab. The truck jolted violently, bouncing slightly as the wheels rolled over the clerk's body. Elliot felt the sickening crunch through the steering wheel, but kept his foot pressed firmly on the accelerator. He couldn't think about it. He couldn't stop. Not now. The fog thinned as he sped away from the motel, the neon Forgotten Mile Motel sign disappearing into the mist behind him. The narrow road stretched out ahead, winding endlessly through the desolate landscape. He didn't know where it led, but he didn't care. He just needed to get as far away as possible. Elliot's hands were trembling on the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he stared out at the road. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, adrenaline still surging through his veins. The truck's engine roared beneath him, a reassuring sound that kept him grounded, kept him moving. But then, reality crept in. The fuel gauge caught his eye, and his stomach sank. The needle hovered just above empty, the red warning light flickering faintly. He had noticed it earlier, but in his desperation to escape, he hadn't let it stop him. Now, though, the inevitability of his situation settled heavily over him. He wasn't going to make it far. The truck began to sputter, its engine coughing weakly. "No, no, no!" Elliot muttered, his voice tight with panic. He pressed harder on the accelerator, willing the truck to keep going, but the engine finally gave out with a pitiful groan. The vehicle coasted a few more feet before rolling to a complete stop. Elliot slammed his fists against the steering wheel, cursing under his breath. He sat there for a moment, the silence pressing down on him, before finally forcing himself to move. He grabbed the door handle and climbed out of the cab, the cool air stinging his sweat-soaked skin. The truck's front end was a mess. The windshield was shattered, spiderweb cracks radiating from the shotgun blast. Blood and viscera were smeared across the grille, dripping in thick, dark streaks down to the bumper. The sight made Elliot's stomach churn, and he had to turn away, steadying himself against the side of the truck. He ran a hand through his hair, his breathing shaky as he looked down the empty road. The narrow stretch of asphalt disappeared into the mist ahead, flanked by dead trees and the faint glow of the rising sun in the distance. There was no sign of the motel or the clerk, just the long, desolate road. Elliot adjusted the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his wounded arm still aching from the gash he'd gotten climbing out of the window. He didn't have a choice. The truck was useless, and staying put wasn't an option. He needed to keep moving. He needed to put as much distance between himself and that cursed motel as possible. He glanced back at the truck one last time, his eyes lingering on the bloodied front end. The image would be burned into his mind forever. He knew that much. With a resigned sigh, he turned and started walking. The road stretched on endlessly before him, disappearing into the fog. The faint crunch of his boots against the asphalt was the only sound, echoing softly in the stillness. He didn't know where he was going or how far he'd have to walk, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going back.